Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Andy Clark. He is professor of cognitive philosophy at the University of Sussex. And today we're focusing on his latest book, The Experience Machine: How Our Minds Predict and Shape Reality. So, Andy, welcome to the show. It's a huge pleasure to finally have you on.
Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, it took us a while to get the diaries to align, but it's great to be here.
Great. So let me ask you before we get into more specific or concrete questions, what is the main argument that you present in your book? What is this experience machine you're talking about?
Yeah, I guess that the core experience machine is a brain, even though I'm really interested in the whole brain-body environment kind of nexus. But the core idea in the book is that we don't experience the world or our own bodies in what you could think of as a kind of raw way. We never, in that sense, get the world or our bodies exactly right. We don't even know really what that would mean. Instead, what we experience arises at the meeting point of what our brains are predicting and what the sensory information seems to be saying. But in a way, that's only half the story. And the other half is that meeting point is kind of unstable. It's always modulated or negotiated by another thing, which is the brain's ongoing estimates of the usefulness, the reliability, the certainty or uncertainty of the predictions versus the sensory information. And I think it's that combination of a central role for prediction and a central role for self-estimated uncertainty that is the sort of real core of this story.
So could we say then that our perceptions are constructs of our brains and do not correspond exactly to something out there in the world, at least directly?
Yeah, of course, venturing into a very, very delicate philosophical territory there. But
Yeah.
I would certainly want to say that what we experience is, if you like, our brain's best guess at the actionable world. So
Okay.
what the actionable world has to do with the world out there as according to physics, for example, that's a whole other question. But what brains are good at, I think, is estimating how best to act and intervene on the world. And what we encounter is a world that is presented to us in a way apt for intervention and poking and prodding and grabbing things and throwing things, all of that. So I think that's what we experience. And is it just a construct? Well, no, because it is deeply anchored in how things
Okay.
are in some way. If you put your foot in the wrong place on the bridge and you plummet into the ravine, you've definitely got something wrong. The world is kind of telling you this is not the right way to go. And so what keeps us in touch with the world are prediction error signals. So the brain is constructing something, making this sort of picture of how things are. But when that picture fails to accommodate the incoming sensory information fully, then prediction errors result. They signal the mismatch between what the brain expects and, if you like, what the brain body system is getting. And they then propagate through the system to try to get a better guess in place. Obviously, this all happens really fast and at multiple kind of little circuitry areas in the brain. So we don't experience that. But as our experience emerges, in a way, we're guessing at the world, letting the world poke back through prediction errors, guessing again, poke back again until we run out of time, or we've accommodated enough prediction error to settle into a picture of how things are, which will normally be kind of on the right track. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here.
But when it comes to predicting the world, the idea of our brain or mind as a prediction machine, originally, where do the predictions our brains make come from? I mean, before we
Yeah.
start having more experience perceiving the world and then correct some of the things that we were getting wrong. I mean, is there anything innate to these
Yeah.
predictions or not?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Obviously, if we're going to construct experience around predictions, the question arises, so where do the predictions come from? And indeed, how good are they? One of the really important early results in this kind of area was that if you take an artificial neural network and you set it the task of predicting the flow of sensory information, then even if it starts with a really bad model of the world, just with random assignments to its weights, the kind of artificial synapses, under those conditions, because it's trying to predict and getting a feedback signal saying, no, you got that wrong, that bit's not a successful prediction, over time, it will slowly come to a set of predictions that work in the kind of environment that you set it to work in. So that's an interesting existence proof, I think, that these kinds of learning systems can refine themselves just by trying to do the prediction task. So you've got this wonderful chance at bootstrapping. But of course, the trouble is that evolved creatures better not start with a really bad model of the world and just rely on prediction errors to tune it. Because if they started from there, then I think they wouldn't survive long enough to let the flow of prediction errors do the right work. So I think we've got to start with some sort of set of innate, broadly speaking, expectations about the kind of world that we're going to inhabit. But they can be very much refined during childhood. Perhaps they even start to be refined in the womb. You know, there's interesting work about how the sounds that a child is hearing in the womb are actually changing the way that it will hear sounds when it comes out of the womb. So, you know, we're learning machines from the get-go. And what nature and evolution have given us, I think, is kind of just enough expectations about our world to kind of stay alive and keep going, to do some better learning so that we can really tune them so that we become good prediction machines on top of the kind of world we actually live in, which may be very different to the one that was present when evolution selected the broad structures of our neural systems. So predictions come from the effort to predict plus evolution.
And does memory also play a role here? I mean, are our predictions informed also by our memories?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, so much so that I think that that memory, if you like, is nothing other than the generative model that is issuing the predictions. So, and this is generative model in the same sense as work in generative AI that we're all seeing at the moment. It's an inner organization that has the power to create simulations of data structures for itself. I think that's what memory is. Memory is a way of kind of self-cueing so as to create a data structure that is very similar to the one that you might have encountered previously in your existence. So memory, I think, is a sort of, in a way, it's the heart of the prediction machine. Predictions are based on memory, but it's this very structured kind of memory that allows the system to simulate the world for itself. And that, I think, it's a kind of very special kind of memory. Hawkins, who wrote one of the early books in this sort of area, actually described the brain, I think, as a memory prediction machine. So.
And tell us about this idea of perception as controlled hallucination. What does that mean?
Yeah, I have a sort of love-hate relationship with that phrase. It's been around for a while. I've used it myself. I don't think anyone knows exactly where it comes from. Some people think it comes from Max Klaus, a machine learning theorist. There are other possibilities. I've heard it used by Anil Seth as well. So what does it mean, perception as controlled hallucination? The core idea is just that perception involves this process of construction, where what you already know is being used to try to construct a picture of how things are that is then sent out to meet the sensory information so that only the differences between what you've constructed and what's indicated by the incoming information get to do further work, trying to draw out different, more refined predictions. So to that extent, we're kind of, if you like, hallucinating our world but we're doing it in a way that is highly controlled, hence the controlled hallucination. It's controlled by basically estimating uncertainty properly, so knowing how much you should be relying on current prediction error versus expectation. That might be very different on a foggy day compared to a non-foggy day, for example. And also, just the goodness of the model that you started with. So I think it's fine to talk about perception as controlled hallucination, as long as we really, really don't lose sight of the controlled bit in there. We are anchored in some way in the world by prior learning and the prediction error signal. And that's hugely important. Otherwise, we're just making things up and there's no explanation for how come we survive.
Right. So I would like to understand a little bit better how the dynamic then between the world and our minds work. I mean, what do we get exactly from the world that informs our predictions? I'm trying to understand a bit better what it is, or if there's something about our predictions that corresponds to something in the objective world, or how does it work exactly?
Yeah. So what is it that we're predicting? Basically, waves of energy hitting the sensory receptors. So ultimately, what the brain is trying to predict is how its own sense organs are going to be modified by incoming energies from the outside world, either pressure in airwaves or wavelengths of light, or all the stuff that we're actually getting information from. Sorry, there was something else in your question there, though? That's what we're trying to predict. But of course, in order to predict that, we use a whole cascade of predictions, starting from really abstract predictions, like I'm in my office, and so I predict desk type things, microphone, ring lamps, all of this stuff. But those predictions, of course, then have to reach down to the point where they're actually, now I'm looking up at the ring lamp briefly. I'm making quite fine-grained predictions about where things are in space, how the kind of light and shadow is falling. And prediction errors at that level are kind of much closer to the incoming sensory information. They then have to be used to correct things in a way that might cascade all the way up to the high-level prediction, so that maybe it's like, oh no, my ring light is broken today, I'm using someone else's and it looks completely different, that kind of thing. So there's a lot going on, but it's basically trying to get to grips with waves of energy, and the best way of getting to grips with those waves of energy turns out to be to hallucinate, if you like, or to I will say that word, to hallucinate a world of middle-sized objects, things like ring lights and microphones and desks, because they're the things that we can interact with. That's the sort of right level of description to capture a world which is apt for human interaction, so that I can then decide, I need to adjust the angle of the ring light. Okay, this is what I need to do. I think that's what we're trying to get with these flurries of prediction and prediction error.
But I mean, this is more of a metaphysical question, I think. But okay, when it comes to what we perceive, to what extent does that correspond to something really out there in objective reality?
See there, I was hoping you'd forget about that question along the way of that previous answer, because that is a really, really good question to ask. I think the answer is that we don't know. I don't actually know how anyone could, if you like, sort of put together what we learn about objective reality from physics, which I think is kind of our best shot at something like reality as it is, independent of human thinking and reasoning. It's probably not completely independent, but at least it's a shot. And then the stuff that we see, you can show that the stuff that we see is kind of the stuff that we see is not impossible, given what we know about the ultimate nature of reality. If we take contemporary physics seriously, it's not impossible. But if you then ask, so to what extent is it accurate or right, then I don't think there's any further answer than it's just a picture that does the best job of letting us interact with our world and agree with the other humans that we share the world with. So I think there's those sort of two forces kind of acting upon us to keep our pictures in line with each other, and that's agreement with each other, and in line with the world, and that's the fact that my actions have to succeed or I kind of fall off the bridge and die. So beyond that, I don't think there's anything to say about how close we are to reality or far from it. Most of the time, we're just good enough to get by. And I think that's, that's all that evolution wanted. Didn't want to spend kind of extra money and resources on kind of fine tuning how we see the world. If there's no benefit in action, why would evolution care about that? So I think it's all about acting successfully. So when you've got a picture that lets you act successfully on the world, and you're kind of able to agree with the others that you're acting in the world with, then I'm happy to say that's as close to reality as we're going to get. Thank you.
Yes, but then let me ask you a somewhat different kind of question related to that. So, but can we say that the things we perceive, I don't know, the computer, the ring light, the microphone, are real? I mean, that word, they're real. Can we apply it to the kinds of things we perceive or not?
Yes, okay. I want to say, I come clean here. I want to say it's real. I want to say that I can say that the microphone in front of me is real. I can raise it up. There we go. It's definitely, what was that old philosophical slogan? Something like, if you can kick it, it's real, or something. So yeah, I think it's real. But at the same time, because my view here is that reality is the interactable space, if you like, then something that appears to me in a sufficiently complex virtual reality would be just as real as a microphone. Because if I can interact with it and I can agree with other people on what it is and everything works well like that, then that's as good as we've got in the real world. So yeah, real, but is it reality as we might have pre-theoretically wanted it to be, where it's really, really, really real? I don't think we can say that. All we can say is this is a picture that lets us get by.
Mm-hmm. And so if we were plugged into Robert Nozick's experience machine, the kind of information it would feed our brain, could we say then that whatever kind of experiences we have there would be as real as what we perceive in the outside of the machine, let's say?
Okay, confession time. When I called the book The Experience Machine, I didn't even know about the Nozick thought experiment. So the book title has nothing particularly to do with that, nor am I an expert on that thought experiment. My intuition is that I want to say yes. I want to say that, if you like, as long as my grip on the world is sufficient to interact with it properly and I'm able to agree with others at that time, then I can't think of anything else to demand. And if I understand that thought experiment correctly, which I may not, then that's what Nozick is trying to give us, a situation where we kind of have some intuition that we're disconnected from the world, and yet all of that interaction and agreement space is somehow preserved. To the extent that that's possible, then I'm happy to say that, that's just sort of more reality, if you like, a kind of extended version of the same reality.
Mm-hmm. We're going to get more into extended cognition later, but let me ask you now, how do you look at the relationship between sensory information and expectation? What is expectation in this context?
Yeah, so expectation here, I use the word pretty much synonymously with prediction here.
Okay.
So, if I ever do try to make a distinction, it would be that expectations tend to have more to do with conscious expectations. Prediction captures a lot of the unconscious stuff too. But a lot of the time I just use them interchangeably. So what do we say about those? Well, they're, if you like, structured, linked representations of an actionable world. That's, I think, that is the bedrock of what I think here, is that actionability is a kind of keystone, and you have structured, linked representations that are doing things like helping me locate objects in space and helping me interact successfully with the objects. So I need to locate the microphone right now in space because I've decided to look at it. And if I was going to pick it up, then I need to pre-understand stuff about where the heavy bits are, how I should pick it up if I want to use it in a certain way. And all of that information is a sort of interlinked structure that, that, if you like, gets sent out towards the sensory peripheries so that it can meet incoming sensory information and work out whether all of those things were adequate or not. And if they're inadequate, then my brain will have another go. And if I judge them to be adequate, then my whole brain-body system will probably have a go at picking it up. And if I got it wrong, then prediction error signals will again result. So there are lots of places along the chain here where the world can correct me, if you like. It can correct me just by, I take a better look and it now looks a little bit different. I didn't get the contour quite right first time. Or it can correct me because I actually tried to use that information and couldn't, and sort of failed to pick it up properly. So that sort of, it's an interlinked data structure where everything is already bound together that is trying to predict the flow across the time-locked flow across all of the sensory interfaces, sight, sound, touch. And that's, of course, a very complex and difficult task, but one that brains like ours seem enormously well adapted to perform. Don't know if that helps.
So cognitively speaking, this process also ties to learning, right? Because it's through learning that we kind of update our predictions about whatever we are perceiving.
Right? Yeah. So learning, I think learning is kind of, it's happening all the time. It's not sort of, so unlike actually a lot of contemporary work in machine learning, what brains are always turned on in learning mode. So everything that's going on can, if you like, affect the underlying generative model. And learning just is the process of updating the generative model that is, if you like, that is I want to say represented in the brain, but I don't want that to sound too much like classical forms of representation. Some people just like to say it's kind of structurally inherent in how the brain becomes after you've been engaged with stuff in certain ways. So yeah, obviously there are real physical changes that correspond to the changes at this more abstract level in what's in the generative model and how it behaves. But yeah, so learning is updating the generative model, and we're doing it all the time.
And through this framework, how would we approach illusions, or what people in cognitive science and neuroscience call illusions? How would we understand them and approach them?
Yeah, illusions are really, really interesting, I think, because they're sort of one of the places in which the fact that the brain is a prediction machine becomes apparent to us, because what the sort of illusory contexts are doing in general is messing with our predictions by, if you like, sort of tripping us up, because our prediction machinery makes assumptions about how the world is, and in a lot of the illusions, those assumptions are not correct. So in an Amy's room, for example, where you see someone there and they look really, really big at the back of the room, like giants, it's because of sort of the what's the word? Kind of like contours, the lines and shapes in the room are such that in the real world you would most normally come across those building kind of square-like structures, And if a person's head reached the ceiling there, then they would be really big. But of course, in the actual AMIS room, the structures don't work like that. And so a small person is kind of reaching the ceiling at one end. So I think all illusions have something of this structure. Think about the favorite in this, maybe in this whole literature, the hollow mask illusion, where you take a standard joke shop mask and you turn it so that the concave side is facing you, you light it from behind, and you retire to about 5 foot away. Under those conditions, it looks like the convex side of the mask is facing you. So you see a face with the nose sticking out, even though what you're actually in front of is the side where the nose is sticking in and actually sticking out the back of it. So what's going on there seems to be that we have such strong predictions about the typical shape of faces with noses coming outwards that the real information that's coming from the world specifying concavity is just being trumped or being superseded by a strong prediction. We've got a prediction that we assign high, or our brains automatically assign high reliability to, and that means that real sensory information is being treated as noise and just ignored as the percept of the world emerges. And I think this is what's going on in very, very many cases of illusions. It's manipulating our expectations and certainties to allow the brain to force onto the world something that in this case isn't actually there. Anyway, there are many, many more cases there that we could talk about. There's the case of the dress, the famous dress that people see as blue or gold. It's a very beautiful account of how all that works. But maybe we'll come to those later.
Yes, but let me ask you then, when it comes to illusions, would you call them perception or prediction errors? Are they errors, or are they just the normal way our perception and cognition work?
Yeah. I think I prefer the latter. I think I say this is just the normal way that perception and cognition works. It's a process that is dependent on assumptions, and to the extent that those assumptions are sort of are in place in the particular context, then you're going to perceive the world as it is, if you like. And if you mess around with those assumptions, then you will get some other kind of percept. So, in the case of the dress that we just mentioned, the assumptions seem to be to do with where the light's coming from. Is it coming from above, or is it a more sort of diffuse light? So is it the kind of light you'd have in an artificial setting where the source is rather simple and coming from a certain position, or is it more like daylight? It seems that people that assume it's more like daylight see the dress as gold, whereas people whose brains assume it's an artificial light see the dress as blue. There's actually an interesting relation between whether you're a lark or an owl, whether you're someone that likes to rise early in the morning or linger in bed a lot longer. It turns out that people who are naturally larks tend to see the dress as gold, and people who are naturally owls tend to see it as blue because they've had more experience of artificial light versus natural light. This is work by Pascal Wallisch and co in New York. And I think it's rather wonderful because it shows how little features of our daily experience install the kind of predictions that structure perception in ways that may hide unexpected differences between different individuals, like the people that see it as blue and the people that see it as gold.
Okay, but in the case of the dress, there's in that particular case, at least there's an objective answer, right? I mean, if someone would bring on the dress, we would know for sure if it's blue or yellow.
That's right, because the actual photograph, if I remember this right, was taken in artificial light, and so blue is the correct answer. I think that's right. And then the people that see it as gold, like me, well, there it is. I think it looks much prettier as a gold dress. So I'm pleased to be seeing it as gold, but I am wrong in that case in some reasonably objective sense. I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And how does this all relate to 4E cognition? 4E cognition being embedded, enacted, extended, and embodied cognition. What is the relationship here?
Yeah, that is a question that many people ask me, partly because I'm being fairly strongly associated, my own previous work, quite strongly associated with both embodied and extended cognition. So, there's a sort of question arises: why on earth is Clark interested in predictive processing that to some people looks like a very disembodied, brain-centered picture of what mind and cognition is?
Yeah.
But deep down, I think that actually, there had to be some account of what brains do in these complex brain-body world systems. And predictive processing seems to me to be the best such account that has emerged so far. And among the reasons why I think that that's, if you like, good news for 4E cognition rather than bad news for 4E cognition is that the sort of core of what the brain is trying to predict is action. So, I think brains like this are really action systems. All these predictions are constructed so as to enable us to act better on the world. So embodied cognition is at the forefront. These are generative models that are there for creatures that have bodies and want to use those bodies to do things in the world. But then there's one other thing that is worth bringing in, which is that as action systems, what predictive brains are doing for the brain-body system, if you like, is exploiting it to get better information all the time. So because of this constant estimation of our own certainty or uncertainty, which is really the core of the predictive processing picture, then brains will control bodies to perform actions that reduce their own uncertainty, so that they can get things done better. So if I want to go and see a movie tonight, then to produce the right sequence of actions, I'm going to do things like consult the web to find out what time the movie starts, consult the web to find out when the bus comes. The use of the external world as an information resource flows really automatically from the underlying way that predictive processing structures information flows. They're all about gathering information to reduce uncertainty to act successfully. So for that reason, there's back in the day when I was working on the extended mind, there was an ongoing puzzle, which was something like, so how does the right stuff come together at the right time? There's something like there's some neural work going on. And then there's some physical stuff. Maybe I'm reaching out and looking at a notebook or consulting an iPhone or the web. And how does the right set of resources come together at the right time to solve the problem? Predictive processing, I think, is the answer to that question. And it all comes together under ongoing estimates of what will best reduce the uncertainties that need to be reduced as we try to do the things we want to do. So that's a kind of long-winded answer, but basically, I think what looks like a neurocentric framework here turns out to be one that will automatically engage the body in ways that minimize uncertainty using resources in the world. So then we've got extended cognition, natural-born cyborgs, all the other stuff that I've kind of cared about in the past.
But I mean, if we agree or if we accept this 4E cognition framework, then where exactly is the boundary between ourselves and the outside world, cognitively speaking? Or is there even a boundary, a precise boundary? Or
yeah, boundaries are a very hot topic in active inference and predictive processing, because there's an awful lot of work that stresses, and rightly in a way, the importance of a statistical construct called a Markov blanket, which kind of sounds like it might be a physical thing, but isn't really. It's just a statistical construct where you, if you like, you parse the information flow within some large system in a way that enables you to treat parts of that information flow as arising at the boundary, and other parts, so some parts are on the outside, some are on the inside, and some are on the boundary. But it turns out that because that's just a statistical construct, you can apply it in all kinds of ways. If you're looking at the blind person with the cane, you can motivate a Markov blanket that includes the edge of the cane as well. Or you can have a Markov blanket that stops where the brain stuff stops. Or you can have a Markov blanket that stops where the hippocampus stops. So this is just to say that I think the question where the boundaries really are is a question that we shouldn't ask. We should just say, given what I'm trying to explain right now, where is it useful to think about boundaries? And that depends on what you're trying to explain, and not just what, but with what sort of perspective you're trying to explain it. So someone that is interested in city planning is going to be very interested in a lot of boundaries that lie outside individual brains, but include lines of sight with sort of trees and walls and fences and stuff like that. Other people might be much more interested just in what the brain's doing and kind of how it can sort of how it can sculpt and control a very local interaction with the world. So boundaries, I think, are super important, but should never be taken so seriously that we cease to look at what appears to be outside of them. And sometimes when we do that, we realize there's another whole way of looking at the system where it's that larger perspective that is actually more fruitful. And I think that's what the history of distributed and embodied and extended and inactive cognition has really been doing for us, is just kind of saying, hey, look at some of these larger holes and the patterns that are emerging in them.
But since you mentioned a concept like the Markov blanket, does all of these, I mean, the idea of the brain as a predicting machine and stuff like that, does it also connect, at least to some extent, with the free energy principle or not?
Yeah, I think it. Yeah, I mean, yes has to be the answer. It connects deeply with the free energy principle. Nonetheless, most of my own work steers slightly clear of the free energy principle, which kind of does its work at a very, very abstract theoretical level that is kind of, I think it is doing very interesting work. It's trying to say from first principles, like, what does it take to be an object? What does it take to be a living system? You can say things about persistence in the face of perturbation that seem really interesting. The mathematics, so I'm told, looks an awful lot like some of the mathematics of predictive processing. So you can kind of see you can see a living system, for example, as morphologically a kind of prediction of the sort of environment that it's going to live in. The shape of the fish is a kind of prediction of the hydrodynamics of seawater. So, once you're using the free energy principle, then I think a lot of things fall into place, but the cost of them falling into place is that very often what you're dealing with isn't sort of process level prediction in the way that the original computational explorations in this area were looking at sort of process level prediction. That probably didn't really make all the sense I wanted it to, but I think the kind of idea there is that the free energy principle is a really, really big picture that tells us a lot of things that are probably necessary truths about life and mind. They're very, very helpful because they put life and mind on a kind of a continuous trajectory. But deep down, my own interest is in the process model that is implemented by the human brain. So to that extent, I'm kind of, I'm very interested in what are the actual computations being performed by the brain when it solves problems like revealing a structured world to me in perception. And deep down, I don't think that every living system encounters a structured world in perception. I I don't know. No one knows. But I don't think that a single-celled bacterium, maybe not a plant either, encounters a structured world in perception or by perception. So I think there's something very interesting about what complex brains are doing that is somehow making experience of the kind that we recognize as experience possible. And I think that's got an awful lot to do with, cascades of prediction that bring together multiple sources of information and that reach across multiple timescales. And at that point, I think that's where, if you turn up all those dials on a free energy account, you get the kind of process level accounts that I've mostly looked at.
Mm-hmm. So another thing that you also talk a little bit about in the book has to do with the sort of implications that this framework would have for neurology and psychiatry. So could you tell us a little bit about that? And then I will ask some follow-up questions about it.
Yeah. So, if you were to ask what's the practical value or the cash value of treating the brain as a kind of prediction machine that is constantly estimating its own uncertainty, I think the answer is computational psychiatry. I think what it looks increasingly like you can do is apply this general picture of how brains like ours process information, and then ask the question, suppose that you change some of the settings so that you were put in, so that you estimated the certainty of sensory information more highly than other people, or you estimated it more low than other people. What would happen then? Well, it's being argued here that if you put an extra weight on the sensory information so that you're really enhancing the value of the sensory information, think about what that's going to do. It's going to make it harder to bring your top-down expectations to bear on the sensory signal to make things fall into place. The world will seem to be throwing you important information all the time that you need to be taken account of. And that corresponds fairly closely to the phenomenology of autism spectrum disorder, or autism spectrum condition, I should say. So conversely, if you put a lot of value on your own predictions and less value on the sensory information, then you'll hallucinate things just because your brain has started to expect them. And so again, accounts of psychosis seem to emerge quite naturally from that setting of the dials. There's also some very interesting stuff on the way that cycles lock misguided predictions in the case of psychosis or chronic pain. That, as it were, your expectations and predictions help construct a sensory realm that seems to confirm the expectations and predictions. So no matter how many times you sort of encounter things, you're kind of morphing them into the shape that confirms the predictions that led to the altered experiences. So it can be very hard to break out of some of those cycles of depression, chronic pain, functional neurological disorders. They all have this kind of cyclic thing where expectations that things are going to hurt or they're not going to go well alter the way you experience the world and the way that you interact with the world, and you can't gather new information that would revise your estimates of how things are going to go, how much pain you're feeling. So I think that this general picture has a lot of promise for one day delivering a much more nuanced understanding of the whole range of human experience. If you think of us as kind of having multi-level sensory expectations, multi-level predictions, little dials all the way through the brain-body nexus that are set in different ways in different people, constructing worlds of emotion, experience, and pain differently. So that's a very long answer again, but the kind of computational psychiatry, I think, is a really, really exciting area, and one that these accounts can contribute to.
Mm-hmm. But then if someone suffers from some sort of mental illness, like, for example, you gave the example of depression, and I think we can also talk about schizophrenia and stuff like that. Is it a case, or are they cases of our unconscious expectations malfunctioning? Can we talk about malfunctioning here or not?
Well, that's a very, very delicate question. Because in a way, it looks as if the system is just doing what it ought to be doing, but very often just doing it with a kind of a strange estimate of what's reliable or what isn't reliable, or on the basis of aspects of information that are really there, but they're not the only aspects. So, you probably are getting all kinds of signals from the world saying that you're not putting on a good show at this party, or, this talk's not going so as well as I wanted it to, or something. There are real signals there. But if you focus on those and kind of amplify those, then of course you end up with a take on the world that will incline you to act in the world in ways that harvest the sort of information that confirms your predictions. You avoid the party, or you start to mess up your explanations, and so on. So is it malfunctioning? There must be cases where there's something like a very physical malfunction involved. So, if dopaminergic weighting, dopaminergic systems and other neurotransmitter systems are playing the major role that predictive processing thinks they're playing, they're the encoders of these precision weightings that modulate how much value you're putting on prediction versus sensory information. If that stuff really, really starts to fire almost randomly, then all kinds of crazy things are going to happen to you. So that's malfunctioning, I think. But it's quite likely that in an awful lot of the cases that we encounter in the real world, like chronic pain and depression, there's no malfunction. It's just a history of kind of evidence accumulation and habit that has sort of slowly put you into a certain kind of hole. And that hole is really, really hard to get out of, because you seem to be constantly getting information that confirms that your estimates of how things are correct. There's some nice experiments with heat pads that show these effects in perfectly normal subjects. You sort of you set them up with a little geometric cue that predicts a certain kind of high or low intensity heat, and then the subjects are all given, although they don't know this, the same amount of heat through a heat pad. Now, unsurprisingly, the ones who saw the geometric cue associated with a high reading on the temperature scale report experiences of more heat, more pain than the others. But interestingly, no one ever updates their expectations after they've been manipulated with the real heat pads, because they just think this confirms their expectations of more or less heat, because their sensory experience has been morphed in that direction. So it's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. There's a lot of these cycles of self-fulfilling prophecy that float around in these accounts, and I think they all have the same character. Predictions in trained experience that seems to confirm the predictions, even when it would be a lot better for you as an agent to push outside of that little bubble of prediction.
But when it comes to nosology specifically, and the way we classify diseases or mental illnesses in psychiatry and psychology, would this framework have implications there as well? I mean, in terms of how we think and theorize about mental illness?
Yeah, I mean, nosology is one of those words where I'm never quite... It was a new word to me when Carl Friston introduced me to it. I think it means something like is it like a taxonomy, something like that? It's a sort of
yes.
It's kind of like a taxonomy into which these things fall. And so I think it would really make a difference to that, because at the moment, the standard practice is still to taxonomize according to symptoms, really. It's to gather things together as, schizophrenia or autism spectrum condition or, whatever, depression, PTSD, according to patterns of symptoms. But it would be a lot more interesting if you could gather things together, if you could taxonomize on the basis of underlying causes. Something like the dial on prediction is turned up in this particular area, the dial on sensory information is turned up in this other area, that sort of stuff. That might yield a different carving of the space of both neurotypical and atypical response. So maybe one day, I've sort of said this a couple of times in talks, but I still quite like the image. Maybe one day we'll have a sort of periodic table of experiential variation, so that you can see how, if these different dials are turned differently, you get stuff that looks like depression, or it looks like PTSD, or it looks like autism spectrum condition, but you get them in a whole range of different flavors and ways according to the precise settings on those dials. That would be such an exciting development in a way, because just like the periodic table was, it immediately suggests experiments and interventions, and what would happen if we did this, or could we control this by some kind of maybe even by some kind of gene intervention.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that this approach or this framework could also pave the way toward more effective treatments in the case of psychiatry?
Yeah. Yes, I think so. At the same time, okay, let me pick on what I think is the best poster case for this, which is so-called pain reprocessing theory. So people that have chronic pain, and chronic back pain is a great example. Chronic back pain, in about 82% of cases, there seems to be no sufficient underlying structural cause that correlates with the way the pain is experienced, the degree of pain, the context of pain. And this is not just across individuals, but even, the same individual in different times of day and different weeks. So if you take something like that, one of the interventions goes by the name of pain reprocessing theory, is to get people to, first of all, you introduce people to the general theoretical understanding that we've been sharing today, the general idea that experience is always constructed on the basis of this mixture of prediction and sensory information. So you are getting the sensory information from, various nerves, and, used to be called nociceptors, but that just seems wrong, because, pain's just not the sort of thing that you exactly sense. Things happen to those nerves, and then pain happens to us because of the way we're crunching that information together with our own expectations, with our own assessment of the context, with our own estimates of certainty and uncertainty. When all of that comes together, pain is experienced. So once people are introduced to that, then it's a fairly small step to say, there's actually wiggle room in here. You can control your own pain experiences to some extent by changing the set of predictions that your brain is bringing to bear. How do you do that? You mostly do that by acting in ways that go beyond where the current pain signal is kind of telling you to go. So people often talk here about pain as a kind of warning light, as if it's a kind of warning light that is telling you, don't keep doing this, because if you do any more of this, you're really going to hurt yourself. And, that's true for acute pain. That's true if I've just twisted my ankle on a mountain walk or something. Yeah, don't keep walking on that. It's going to get a lot worse. Chronic pain doesn't seem to behave like that. As people say, it's more as if the warning light itself starts to be the problem. You've got the warning light on, it's saying don't do any more. But actually, if the warning light's malfunctioning, because it's your own predictions of the pain you're about to experience that are causing at least part of that pain, then the right thing to do is to behave in ways that for a while you will find uncomfortable. For a while, this is like continuing to drive with the warning light flashing. But the good thing is that over time, it looks as if just by continuing to drive the vehicle, the warning light gets a bit dimmer. It's as if your brain starts to learn that actually the expected consequences weren't quite as bad as you kind of thought they were going to be. You can keep on acting, for example. It's not painful enough to stop you acting. You then downgrade your sort of picture of how bad the pain actually is. And so these interventions that all really go through action, I think, push back against the hidden unconscious predictions that are structuring the experience of chronic pain. And this is the chronic back pain is the one case that has been studied by a couple of pretty big, proper controlled, randomized, big numbers of participants stuff. There's a couple of papers out there that show that there are some very, very good results here, sort of, 70 to 80% of the chronic back pain patients reported improvement in ways that went beyond the improvement you got with placebo under randomized conditions. So, it's a pretty promising. That, I think, is the general picture. These are the sort of interventions that we knew about anyway. Think about cognitive behavioral therapy for depression, for example. But they now fall into place as part of this, as flowing naturally from this picture of prediction as doing a lot of the heavy lifting in constructing experience.
So one aspect of our cognition, or at least I think it's part of our cognition as well, that I haven't asked you about yet, has to do with emotion. So what is emotion, and how do you understand emotion according to this framework?
Yeah, so emotion. That's the other big player, I think, really. Action is I think, the sort of the biggest player in the predictive processing arena, but emotion is somehow right in there, sculpting action patterns. After all, what emotion in some ways is a kind of extra weighting, either in favor of or against particular patterns of response and action. So if we want to start thinking about emotion using this framework, I think we need to look at two things. One of them is interoception. So our sense of what's going on, or our brain sense of what's going on in our own bodies, our brain sense of our heart rate, our brain sense of what's going on in the gut, and so on. So it does seem, this is sort of stuff that William James, as you know, is kind of most famous for saying, it does seem as if the felt nature of emotion is linked in some deep and important way to our appreciation of our own bodily responses. In William James's sort of famous phrase, a feeling, there would be nothing left of the feeling of fear if you subtracted the fast beating heart. That's probably not quite right, actually. But nonetheless, what's emerged in quite a lot of experiments is that if you do give someone sensory information about, say, a fast beating heart, then that can change the way that they perceive the world. So false cardiac feedback and my heart beating quicker than it really is can make me see what would otherwise be a neutral face as an angry face. And so my sort of pickup on emotions in others there is being constructed through my pickup on my own bodily state. And in general, I think emotions involve bodily states in ways that are deeply interleaved with our best grip on the context. Think about the emotion of fear that I might feel if my heart is just suddenly beating quickly. Very, very different to if my heart's beating quickly because I've been exercising at the gym. I'm not gonna feel fear at that point. Not for a minute or two, anyway. So that's one element. Is this that whatever felt emotion turns out to be, it's linked in some important way to appreciation of our own bodily states. And then the other thing is, and this is slightly technical, but I think it's worth doing, is our appreciation of the what is sometimes called the slope of our own prediction error minimization. So I better unpack that a bit. But brains like ours are trying to quash prediction error. That's kind of what they like to do, bring prediction error down within acceptable levels. But because we're evolved creatures, I think we've actually ended up with brains that don't just want to quash prediction error. What they really want to do is to curate useful prediction error so that they can learn more about the world that they inhabit or that we inhabit. That means actually acting in the world in ways that will cause some prediction error, the kind of prediction error that you can resolve by getting a better grip on how your world is. So the work that I'm trying to point to here is sometimes called work in artificial curiosity. And the idea is that if you have a prediction-based system that is interested in getting just the right amount of prediction error to do good learning, then it will avoid situations that are too boring because you're not getting prediction error. You can't really learn anything from them. It will avoid situations that are too difficult because in those situations, you're getting loads of prediction error and you can't tune your model or improve your model to get rid of it. So we tend to avoid those. And then there's the little sweet spot where you're getting enough new information from the world to do some useful learning, but not so much that you can't cope with it or so little that you're bored. And that, I think, is a lot of our sort of, I was going to say human level emotions. I don't know, probably all animals have this, to be honest. But a lot of what we think about when we think about emotion, I think, is our grip on our own rate of minimization of prediction error. We like those situations in which we're doing better than we thought we would at minimizing error. We avoid situations in which we're doing worse than we thought. And situations in which there's none to minimize are just too boring to worry about. So those are the two things that I think this framework can bring to the study of emotion. One is let's look at predictions of bodily state, and the other is let's look at the actual profile of prediction error minimization and see where it's most effective for driving learning.
And would this framework also have something to say about consciousness, and more specifically, even the hard problem of consciousness?
Yeah, almost made me choke on my water there. Yeah, well, who can say? I want to say yes, but the only way I can say yes is by doing what many people would say is changing the subject and not talking about consciousness at all. So I want to say yes because I think it helps us make progress with both the nature of feeling in the ways that we were just talking about. That's to say, the role of bodily prediction in the construction of response, and also our tendency to think that there's a hard problem. So what I think these frameworks can do, but this is ridiculously speculative, but I think that these frameworks fall into place alongside stuff a little bit like Michael Graziano's attention schema account. Sort of, they fall into a space where brains like ours are going to yield pictures of how the world is that present the world as a very puzzling place to us. So if I want to predict my own behaviors, a good way to do it is for me to think about myself as a system that has some likes and dislikes. This is a Dan Dennett example. I'm the kind of person that likes cheese and doesn't like honey, or something like that. And so we sort of populate our own picture of the world with these very simple atomic notions like liking or disliking of cheese or honey. When of course what's really going on underneath is a long trajectory of encounters, some of which activated enough of the pleasure circuitry in the brain, if you like, to get me to come back for more. A lot of this is context dependent. A lot depends also on stuff that I may have just accidentally run across in my explorations of the world, what your parents said, etc. Maybe even some stuff at the level of the distribution of taste receptors in the mouth. So, there's a lot you could say from a kind of non-Cartesian standpoint here. And I think if you end up with a picture where you can say something like this: if I built a robot like this, it might start to say things like, I think I must be a Cartesian mind because I don't really understand how all these thoughts and feelings that I've populated my picture of the world with can correspond to whatever physics tells us is going on. How could that be? Well, it doesn't have to be. Basically this is just what's in our representation of the world, if you like. So if in our representation of the world we have all those things, that's not a problem for physicalism. That's not a problem. That's just the sort of thing that physicalism can easily accommodate, because that's what the brain is busy doing. Look, even I don't feel satisfied with this response. It does seem to me, when I chat with Dave Chalmers, he will always say, yeah, but I can kind of see there's a coherent story to be told there. But do you really think that the particular way that this microphone feels if you run your hands around it, or the particular taste of the pina colada, or the look of the sunset, can they really just be what's going on in my current most successful predictive model of how things are? Why would running that model feel like anything at all? Why wouldn't it just feel like nothing, or feel like making some judgments about the world but not real feelings? I think that's a real challenge. But at the same time, I think that if we did start to be able to build systems that seem to get puzzled about their own experience in the ways we do, that will be a really, maybe a bit of a turning point in our sort of confrontation with the hard problem. And also, if we had something like that periodic table of experiential variation that I was talking about earlier, if we had that and we could use that to launch interventions that would change people's experiences in ways that we could now predict, then I think we might start to think, oh, maybe that was a hard problem. Now we've got a picture, we can intervene on the world. Maybe if you live with that for long enough, you just start to think, oh, I don't know why we ever thought there was a hard problem. This is the solution, and we've not reconstructed anything terribly unexpected there. So yeah, but anyway, my sort of history with the hard problem is a lot of skirmishes, never quite, no surprise, never quite getting anything that I think is fully satisfactory. But I do think it's worth exploring, if you like, how a interoceptively inflected prediction machine capable of launching actions in the world would end up depicting its own mental space, if you like, its own, the originations of its own actions. Maybe that's a way to proceed.
And are there any ways for us to take control of our own experiences? I mean, the ways we experience the world?
Yeah, so that one I think is a lot of thank you for that. It's a lot more tractable than the hard problem. Yeah, so I think just by appreciating the role of prediction in the construction of experience, we can start to understand the kinds of interventions that are likely to be helpful, and some of those are interventions that we can do for ourselves. So reframing is, I think, maybe the easiest of all the examples here. If you take something like my feeling of nervousness before going on stage or doing a talk, I was getting those tingles, about half an hour before we fired this session up, and I've learned to reframe them not as sort of nervousness or I'm going to be so nervous I mess my performance up, but rather chemical readiness to deliver a good performance. It's a tingle of adrenaline. It's a good thing. So that reframing really helps, because it stops you feeling nervous because of your feelings, because you no longer interpret those feelings as nervousness. You interpret them in some other way. So that's reframing like that. Or it's the same thing the dentist is trying to do to you when they say this will just be a gentle tickle, or you might feel a little pressure here. These things are very useful interventions. The pain reprocessing theory stuff, that's another kind of intervention, which is basically just remember that we're machines that learn by action. And so we can't reprogram ourselves in the most interesting and powerful ways normally just by saying things. I think verbal reframing is powerful. It often can do some work, but where you've got something that is really, really deeply ingrained and is causing all sorts of trouble and self-fulfilling action loops, then you need to change the actions before you can change the flow of unconscious prediction that is causing the trouble. And there, I think that just sort of appreciating that you've often got to, as they say, fake it before you make it. Start getting out there and doing more, despite the pain, despite the depression, despite the nervousness, and in some cases that's going to help. There's no one size fits all here. That can make it sound far too glib. One good thing I think about these frameworks is that although they can occasionally sound a little bit like the power of positive thinking, they're really enormously far away from that, because just positive thinking won't really do you any good. What you need to do is entrain a whole cascade of predictions that get things done and that reveal the world to you. Most of those are unconscious, and you just have to repeat the cycle of interaction in the world again and again and again to tune that machinery. So it's a little bit like becoming an expert car driver. If I just start to predict that I'm going to be able to drive the car through this tiny little opening in the traffic, that's not a good thing for a novice to try and do, because they just don't have the underlying structure of skills to cash that prediction out in bodily action. So you then need the full training regimes of learning to drive. And once you've done all that, then of course what you want to do sometimes is make a kind of optimistic but realistic prediction that I can get through that space. Maybe it's important. Maybe you're taking someone to hospital in an emergency run or something. So it's really important to get through that space. Then you want realistic yet optimistic prediction, and that I think is the kind of take-home message for self-care here. Is that very often realistic but mildly optimistic prediction is where we want to be.
And what do we know specifically about the effects of psychedelic drugs? Does that also apply here in the context of this framework?
Yeah, that's a really interesting case. It's not my specialty, but I've hung out a little bit with Carhart Harris and others that work on these things. The picture that I take away from that is that there's a sort of dose-dependent response where at low doses you're kind of intervening on low-level predictions. And so, you may get visual effects, for example, with a kind of low dose of psilocybin or ayahuasca or something. But then at higher doses, it looks as if the cell groups that are affected are preferentially those that are deeper in the processing pathways. So more abstract stuff to do with your picture of yourself and your place in the universe. Now, if you can relax the grip of our self-predictions at those high levels, that could be very beneficial. If you've been chronically depressed for many, many years, relaxing the self-predictions that might be at the heart of some of your depression and just experiencing the world without that could be really revelatory. The same for sort of end of life, and the way you treat your own end of life stuff if you've been diagnosed with terminal cancer or something. Again, these are all cases where it looks as if even a single experience of feeling the world differently by relaxing those high-level self-predictions can really change the way that you feel for a long, long time, like maybe for a year or a couple of years or longer. So it's a really interesting account. It's about the role of psychedelics in relaxing high-level self-predictions, enabling other pictures of how things are and what your relation to the universe is to fall into place. What is it? The rebus model. That's what I think Carhart Harris somewhere calls it, relaxed beliefs under psychedelics. And it's this sort of relaxing of the predictions that are currently structuring your picture of yourself and your relation to the universe, and allowing new stuff to take shape. So another metaphor people use there is shaking the snow globe, like those little toys with snow in them.
Yeah.
Shake it up, and then you can maybe get some new patterns to form.
So we're talking about different kinds of interventions. My last question will be about meditation. So what do we know about what we can do through meditation?
Yeah, meditation's a very, very interesting one. One of my ex-colleagues, Mark Miller, has done an awful lot of work on this. Is, I think, director or co-director of a meditation center in Australia, sort of meditation and cognitive science center. So it looks to me as if for those for whom it really works, and maybe that's those who put in the hours, because it's never really worked for me, but for those for whom it really works, it seems as if meditation gives you greater control over your own precision weighting mechanism. So the precision weighting stuff here is the self-estimated uncertainty that balances the role of prediction against sensory information. So suppose that meditation, by training you to, to focus all your attention on the breath, or to focus all your attention on a stone or something like that, or to experience your thoughts without holding on to them, just letting them kind of come and go. If you do that enough and you gain more control over precision assignments, then it looks as if you gain more control over your own experience of the world. You should be able to confront what would otherwise be very uncomfortable situations in a way that is a bit less uncomfortable, because you don't allow that information the high precision it would otherwise be allowed. So that means it doesn't drive all of your ongoing processing. There's some space for other stuff to still go on. There's also some evidence that highly experienced meditators have some power over the way that they experience certain kinds of manipulation that are common in cognitive science, like binocular rivalry, where you're kind of there are two coherent interpretations of an image that's in front of you. People tend to flick from one to the other. One interpretation sort of takes root, does all the prediction, but you've still got little bits of prediction error coming up from the other one. So that pushes the first one out, the other one comes in, that cycle keeps on repeating. Experienced meditators seem able to intervene on that cycle, just hold the mixed position where you're seeing both images at once, or hold one of the two positions. That suggests to me real control over precision weighting.
Great. So the book is again The Experience Machine: How Our Minds Predict and Shape Reality. I'm leaving a link to it there it is. Very nice cover, by the way. I'm leaving a link to it, sorry, in the description down below. And Andy, just before we go, are there any places on the internet where people can find you and your work?
Yeah. Well, there's if you just Google Andy Clark Sussex, you will get sent towards the I think it's called the Sussex Research Explorer or something, where all the publications are. There are some talks that are available online, and the one that I would most point people to is a Royal Institution discourse. So the Royal Institution has a series called Discourses, and I think that was a really, really fun session. It was quite a long session. The questions went really well. And so you want this sort of account put together in a kind of way that seemed to make sense to me at the time. Runs through all the stuff we talked about today. Well, not all of it. Didn't do emotion, I think, but quite a lot of it, with further examples and some of the big questions that are left open, like stuff like what really is the relation between, if you like, conscious prediction and all that unconscious prediction. There are lots of big questions left, and that's one of them. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So thank you so much for doing this. It's been a great pleasure to have you on the show.
It's been a lovely experience. Thank you, and thanks to everyone for listening. Thank you.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingburg, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Forte, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantanti, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Zigoren, Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alni Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.